Hi, I'm Paul J., and this is the theAnalysis.news podcast. Don't forget, there's a donate button at the top of the webpage. There's been a lot of debate on whether a Biden administration's foreign policy will be all that much different or all that much better than Trump's. While Biden's foreign policy is dressed up in talk of a renewed multilateralism and American, quote, leadership, his thinking is rooted in the Cold War and the need for maintaining America as the global policeman and hegemon. But will Biden at least be less reckless than Trump? How does Trump's record stack up against Biden's? Now joining us to discuss this is Medea Benjamin. She's the co-founder of the women-led peace group Code Pink and the co-founder of the human rights group Global Exchange. She's the author of 10 books, including Drone Warfare, Killing by Remote Control, and Kingdom of the Unjust, Behind the U.S.-Saudi Connection. Her most recent book, Inside Iran, The Real History and Politics of the Islamic Republic of Iran. Medea and her colleagues, in my estimation, have been maybe the most tireless anti-war organizers and campaigners in the United States for years, no matter which party was in power. Thanks for joining us, Medea.
Hey, nice to be on with you, Paul.
Why don't you give me just an overall impression of how you compare a Biden to Trump foreign policy, and then we'll kind of dig into some of the bigger issues.
Well, you brought up the term reckless, and I think that's an important one, which is Trump did a lot of jumping around and going by the gut kind of thing. And, some thought that he was really going to make peace with North Korea and then back down. There's all kinds of pressures on him to not move forward, but he didn't follow through on that. Talked about getting us out of these wars, but we're still in them. And he is so abrasive that it was hard to know where he was going with certain things. And certainly when it comes to being part of the international community of nations, pulling us out of everything from the Paris Accord to the WHO to the UNESCO, Human Rights Council, all of that. I mean, that will change when you get to Biden. But he touts that he didn't start us in a new war. I wouldn't really say that, because if you look at things like the terrible, brutal sanctions on countries like Iran and Venezuela, that's pretty much economic warfare. So I don't feel like Trump in any way was a peace president, as he likes to put himself forward to be. And as you said, Biden is old school. He's kind of it wouldn't be all that different from Obama, which really wasn't all that different from Bush, which wasn't all that different from Trump. So there is a continuity of U.S. as a warlike country that uses militarism way more than diplomacy. But I think things would be, the biggest difference, Paul, in terms of a Biden administration is that we, and I make that in the plurality of people who consider themselves part of a peace movement, would have more ways to pressure a Biden administration.
Let's go through some of the different sort of areas of the world. And I'm going to kind of do this in order, but in a little way out of order, because, the biggest question in terms of U.S. foreign policy, obviously, is China. And I would also say the approach towards nuclear weapons. But let's start with Iran, because it's perhaps the most immediate potential dangerous issue of foreign policy, especially, I think, if there's another 4 years of Trump. And it's probably the one thing that is the most marked difference between Trump and or Bush Cheney vis-a-vis Obama and Biden, and which is the Iran nuclear agreement. So what's your assessment of that?
Yes, that is the number one difference that I think would make a huge difference in the Middle East. The Biden team and Biden himself has talked about going back into the Iran deal. There's questions whether Iran has to go back into compliance first before the U.S. or it would happen somewhat simultaneously. But certainly there is a expectation that Biden would go back in the Iran deal. Things have changed, though, in Iran in these intervening 4 years, in that the hardliners in Iran have gotten the upper hand. Rouhani, who is seen as making the deal with the Americans that turned out not to bring any positive consequences for Iran, has lost out in this. The last parliamentary elections in Iran have brought the more conservative people into power. They're going to be presidential elections there, and it's going to probably be a more hardliner as the head of state. And so it might not be as easy for the U.S. to just go back into the Iran nuclear deal. So we've lost a lot of momentum in the last 4 years. Let's also remember that Trump almost took us into war with Iran at the beginning of last year when the drone strike that killed Soleimani was only did not lead us into war because of the restraining of the leaders of Iran, but it could have really escalated. So I think it will hopefully calm things down if Biden does rejoin the Iran nuclear deal. And that was always supposed to be step number one. You know, Paul, it wasn't the end all. It was supposed to lead to more discussions with Iran on all kinds of issues. And if that could happen, it could really have a positive effect for other areas of the Middle East, like Iraq and Syria and Yemen and Lebanon and beyond.
Yeah, as you say, the Iranians spent so much time negotiating this deal, restructure their whole nuclear program, which there's still no evidence was a nuclear weapons program. And I still think there's not an actual national intelligence estimate that's ever countered the one from a few years ago, which said that, in fact, there was no longer any weapons program.
Right.
But that said, they certainly did restructure and went through all these negotiations, signed the deal, and then it doesn't mean anything because Trump just backs out of it. And as they say, you know, what's the line? They don't have a reliable partner to negotiate with here.
Well, that's for sure. And those who said don't trust the devil of the U.S. Were right in the end, because you can't trust the U.S. if it wasn't a treaty, because Obama didn't go back to Congress for that, didn't think he had the votes.
Didn't have the votes because people like Chuck Schumer and his own party wouldn't support it.
Well, that's right. Absolutely. And so it was just done by the executive agreement, which meant that Trump could come in and what he did, pull us out. But it does. It certainly has made for a very difficult 4 years for the Iranian people, who have been suffering a lot under these sanctions.
Larry Wilkerson, who lobbied on the Hill in Congress in favor of the nuclear deal with Iran, said it was very nip and tuck whether there was going to be enough votes, and it took Biden's fighting on the Hill. And there were some very significant votes in Congress, both in the House and in the Senate, where the Republicans tried to kill the agreement, because if they had over 60 votes, they could vote to kill the deal with Iran. Biden lobbied very strongly in favor of the deal, and that means in opposition to people like Chuck Schumer and his own party, as I said, who were against the deal. So to me, so if you're going to go through positives, because there's certainly quite a few negatives on Biden, that's maybe one of the most important positives.
Absolutely. I think that's a very important one. I mean, that was the signature achievement of the Obama administration, and Biden was part of that. And so I think he would go back into that deal, and he certainly saw the benefit of it back then. He's been talking a little bit harder line, these days, but that's campaigning. So yes, I think that is a number one positive thing that could come out of a Biden administration foreign policy.
And given Trump's approach to Iran and a lot of the people around him, I don't believe they are going to give up on the idea of at least massive destabilization of Iran, if not still some attempt at regime change. And those two things go together. An Iranian friend of mine said what they really want in Iran is the destruction of the society as they accomplished in Iraq. Okay, so some of the other critical issues in the Middle East, let's start with Yemen, because that's a war that's destroying another society in the Middle East. How do you compare where Biden and Trump are on that?
Well, see, that's where I think there's another real positive potential, because the past couple of years there has been tremendous work from the grassroots, and that has been forming a coalition from left to right, from Code Pink to the Cato Institute, libertarians, to even Freedom Works and some of the Koch brothers groups, to try to stop the U.S. support for the Saudi-led war in Yemen. And you talked about Larry Wilkerson. He worked very hard on this as well. And we managed several times, actually 4 times, to get bills to through both the House and the Senate. And that wasn't easy to do. And they got to the president's desk, and what did he do? He vetoed them. Now, I don't think a Biden administration would use the veto for that. I don't think Biden would go so far as to say, well, let's stop the weapon sales to the Saudis, even though he said that Saudi Arabia should be a pariah state. But I do think that he would not block a new bill that went through Congress saying that the U.S. should not be giving the logistical support or selling the weapons that are used by the Saudis in Yemen.
Trump, before the election, a couple of years before he got elected, was quoted as saying, if you want to know what happened on 9/11, just go talk to the Saudis. But once he got elected, he sure didn't have any trouble. What was that famous picture of touching the globe?
Yes, the orb.
The orb, yeah.
And the sword dancing. And his first voyage outside the U.S. was not to Canada, not to Mexico. It was to Saudi Arabia.
Not kiss the ring, kiss the orb, yeah. Okay, so Yemen, there could be a marked difference. And I have to say, each one of these things are not just items on a grocery list. So far, talking about Iran and as you mentioned, the economic warfare against Iran, we're talking hundreds of thousands of lives and people dying. And you have a COVID crisis in Iran at a time where they can't get ventilators, and the sanctions are causing, starvation. And the same thing, a terribly destructive war in Yemen. So these differences are just not minor issues.
That's right. Catastrophic in Yemen, and especially now with the combination of the war and the pandemic and climate change and hunger. I mean, we're talking about lots of lives being lost in Yemen, and then the U.S. cutting aid to Yemen as well. And I don't think Biden would do that. So between Iran, Yemen, you're right. There are a lot of lives that could be saved with the new administration. All
right. So we'll stay roughly in the same area. And, we are going to get to Israel-Palestine. But before we do, Trump has gotten some credit for pulling troops out of Afghanistan and Syria. But let's start with Afghanistan. What do you make of his moves there?
He has been engaging in peace talks now for a year. The fighting has continued. It's a catch-22 because the Taliban say as long as there are foreign troops, we will keep fighting. And so then the peace talks do not culminate in a peace agreement. And the peace talks started, for a long time, they were just between the Taliban and the U.S., not between the Taliban and the Afghan government. Now they're starting with the Afghan government, and there has been progress made, but it hasn't been culminated. And the troops that the U.S. is withdrawing is a positive step, but there's still thousands of troops there. And the Democrats step in and say, "Oh, you can't pull out these troops." So Trump has been stymied in pulling back on in both both Afghanistan and in Iraq, but. He says that he's so great on fulfilling his promises. He promised to end the endless wars, and his term is ending without ending the war either in Afghanistan or in Iraq.
What do you think Biden would do any differently? And let me just say, I made a film in Afghanistan and, followed it since. And it's an incredibly complicated situation because the Americans created the conditions for the disaster in Afghanistan under Jimmy Carter, and then each administration afterward arming the jihadists and creating this terrible vacuum after the Soviets left and allowing close to 2 million people to be killed in a civil war, and out of which the Taliban arose, mostly under the tutelage of the Pakistani Secret Service, the ISI. So it's a crazy, complicated situation because the majority of people, I believe, from having been there and talked to many, many Afghans, they do not want the Taliban back. The only thing that's happened is they're just so worn out by endless war that it's better to have some kind of peace deal than, as I say, a war that just never ends and keeps killing so many people there. And even on the issue of U.S. troops, I think there is something to the argument that it creates somewhat of a vacuum. But most of the Afghans I know, progressive Afghans, they do want the U.S. out, but they don't want it done as part of a deal with the Taliban.
Yeah, you could say that, but the reality is the Taliban are Afghans. They live in Afghanistan. They are Afghans, many of them young people who had no way to earn a living and were offered some money and went to fight. And, the people of Afghanistan have been fighting for decades now. It's for many men, the only thing that they know, the only jobs that they have had. And so do you just keep perpetuating this forever? The Taliban are not going to go away. They control a lot of Afghanistan, and they have nowhere to go. So you have to make a deal with the Taliban.
No, the people I'm quoting are saying Afghans should make deal with the Afghans. The Americans shouldn't be part of any deal. They should just get out.
Oh, well, right. Yes. But then you said they don't want the Taliban.
Yeah, but they want Afghans to settle it. They don't want the Taliban back in power, but they want Afghans to deal with the Taliban. They don't want the Americans to broker a situation that gives perhaps at least half the country to the Taliban. They want the Americans just to get out, and then the Afghans will have to settle it. Now, I'm not sure how realistic that position is because the Afghans have, the Taliban have such a powerful armed force, and I'm not sure what happens if it doesn't just descend into a terrible civil war after that. But they don't. The people have talked to do not want the Americans to broker anything.
Right. And then you asked, well, what would happen with a Biden administration? I think there would be more of the possibility that more troops stay for a longer time with the Biden administration.
Yeah, more than likely. It's one of these situations where it's such a terrible situation that was created in the first place. The real answer, we don't need to get into that in detail now because it's not what this segment's about. There needs to be some kind of regional peace conference. It can't just be up to the Americans what happens there, especially when the Americans created the mess in the first place. But at any rate, let's move on. Let's talk about Israel-Palestine. Do you see any difference between a Biden and Trump administration on Israel-Palestine?
Not anything significant. It's so interesting, Paul, these new, quote, peace deals that the Trump administration has been making between Israel and the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain and now Sudan. Biden himself has said that those are good. We should talk about why I don't think they're good, but I don't think the Biden administration would necessarily continue on that track of pushing for more of those deals to be made. But certainly I don't see a Biden administration using the $3.8 billion that U.S. taxpayers give every year to Israel as a leverage for getting Israel to do anything that would improve the lives of the Palestinians. I really don't see him doing anything very different from what the last administrations have been doing. And he talks about what a great friend of Israel he is, and that he would not condition the aid, even though other members of the other people in the primary races started saying they would condition the aid. He refused to do that. So I don't have any positive expectations about Biden and Israel.
This next question kind of applies to everything, but particularly to Israel and Palestine. Bernie Sanders and a lot of the people associated with him and the progressive candidates on the Hill have taken quite a different attitude towards Israel-Palestine. When it came last time to negotiating the program of the Democratic Party, Biden asked Cornel West to go and recommend him. This is not this election. This is the previous one with Hillary. And they took quite a fairly strong position in terms of Palestine having rights as a people, as a nation. Do you see any of that kind of influence of the Sanders-esque kind of approach being able to have any influence on Biden and U.S. foreign policy?
Potentially. I think there will be efforts within Congress coming from Democrats in Congress to move things up to the White House that would then put Biden in a difficult position. But I don't. So I think there are possibilities there. But Biden has always talked about being best friends with the Israelis, and he certainly has decades of support for the Israelis when he was head of the Foreign Relations Committee in the Senate. So I don't think so.
And what about the sort of antagonism that developed between Netanyahu and Obama? I mean, was that personal, or was it more substantial? And might that spill over to Biden?
I think there was it was both personal and a bit substantial in that Biden would Netanyahu was so brazen with the authorization of new settlements just at the time when he was visiting the U.S. or things like that. But in the end, what did that antagonism lead to in terms of any change of U.S. policy? It didn't lead to anything. So maybe there would be a PA office would open up again in the United States.
Palestinian Authority.
Some symbolic things like that.
Hasn't Trump more or less cut funding to the PA?
Yes, and so there could be a restoration of some of the funds and cutting funding to UNRWA, to the refugees, Palestinian refugees. That could be something that would come back. But, in terms of moving towards something that would actually lead to lifting of the siege of Gaza, that would lead to Palestinian equal rights, I just don't see that happening. I see things around the edges which are important. For example, around the issue of calling out the Israelis for their treatment of juvenile prisoners, or maybe pushing for some greater openings when it comes to the aid going to Gaza. And though that kind of relief is important, not saying that it's meaningless.
And it used to be a sort of issue for the Americans that to please the Saudis, supposedly, and some of the other Gulf states and so on, they couldn't be so completely one-sided pro-Israel. But if Trump's proven anything, it's actually the other way. He could be completely historically one-sided pro-Israel and then bring all of these rich Arab states on board. So there won't even be any of that kind of pressure, even though it never amounted to that much anyway.
Yeah, I mean, he did want to get the most important of the Arab states, which was the Saudis. And I think if he were to get the Saudis, there would have to be some concession. But hopefully he'll be out of the White House and we won't see that as the route being taken.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Saudis didn't play along because it just wouldn't look good for them in terms of domestically to have to worry about such things. But in reality, there's all kinds of Saudi-Israeli cooperation anyway. So,
well, and of course, and that's true of the Emirates and Bahrain. To call these peace deals with countries that they have not been at war with is quite strange. And of course, if you look below the surface, there are weapons deals. Now, that's another thing that might be different in a Biden administration, because the issue of the weapons being sold to the Emirates will come up in Congress next year. And they are asking for F-35s as part of the sweetening of their making the deal with the Israelis. And then now the Israelis are saying, well, we always have to have that military edge. And so you have to give us, we don't sell the Israelis, we give them more sophisticated weapons. And it's just a new arms race in the Middle East. And so if we can build up opposition to the sale of the F-35s to the Emirates in Congress, which we are starting to do, that will reach Biden's desk, and it will be a real showdown to see, can we get Biden to not veto that, meaning the U.S. would stop the sale to the Emirates, not agree to more weapons giveaways to Israel, and that would be positive as well.
Let's talk about Iraq. Now, of course, this is the biggest strike against Biden, that he voted for the resolution that enabled the invasion of Iraq. He claims he didn't really get that it would necessarily lead to the invasion, but he also said it was a mistake that he voted for it. Certainly, there were lots of other people, Bernie Sanders, but also many others, who understood that resolution would enable war, and they opposed it. And Biden went along with it, I suppose, mostly out of his own political opportunism. There was a lot of pressure to support the war, and he did. And then later he says he's wrong. I think it's a lie of Trump to say he was against the war. If you go back to what he was saying at the time, he was more or less for it. He wasn't, maybe perhaps as gung-ho as some others, but he certainly never came out against it. And then later, after he was inaugurated, one of his first visits was to make up with the CIA. He went to CIA headquarters in early 2017. And he said something very interesting there, which was that he says, I never thought we should have let go of the oil, that his big critique of the Iraq war was the United States didn't grab the oil. And then he says to them, you may have a chance to do it again. It sounded serious that there actually could be some other attempt to grab Iraqi oil. Now, that hasn't happened. But in the second term, especially if they get very provocative with Iran or actually start some kind of fight with Iran, then who knows what the hell Trump does in Iraq. But what's your assessment of this whole thing in terms of Biden, Trump, Iraq?
Well, I do think that Trump would like to get out of Iraq. He has certainly talked about it a lot, and he has faced the same kind of opposition he faced in trying to get out of Syria, get out of troops out of Afghanistan. And after the Iraqi parliament voted that the U.S. should leave, it would have been a good time to say, okay, we're leaving. Instead, he will end his term with thousands of U.S. troops still in Iraq, and not having completed that promise either. I think when the Iraqi parliament said, we want you out, that probably made him feel like, oh, well, now we're not going to leave. And certainly the comments around the take the oil are not something that the Iraqis take very kindly to. But, whatever Trump says, just like any other leader, we can't listen to. We have to look at what he's done, and he hasn't fulfilled that promise.
Yeah, I'm not so sure he wants to get out of Iraq because of the strategy to do with Iran. That the only reason he might want to get U.S. troops out of Iraq is that so they're not such an easy target, that if they do start a provocation from the sea and from the air, maybe they don't want American troops within missile range.
Right. They don't need them on the ground. In fact, they've consolidated so much in Iraq and closed a number of the bases to not have so many U.S. soldiers being sitting ducks there. But I don't think that Trump wants a ground war. He wants an air war.
Let's go to the biggest question facing U.S. foreign policy, and that's China. And I see now on the Code Pink website, there's a campaign. It's a petition addressed to Kamala Harris that China is not our enemy. Why Harris? And then talk a bit about Biden-Trump vis-a-vis China.
Well, she has she Asian American roots, and we are just so disgusted about the way that Trump and Biden, in their macho threats against China, Biden calling the head of China thug, the Trump, of course, being just horrendous in his China flu and Kung flu and trade war with China and China. It's both of them are terrible on this. So we thought, why not appeal to a woman in a critical position, somebody who has Asian roots, and somebody who understands that this kind of rhetoric has implications at home in the repercussions against the Asian American community. So that was our reasoning behind appealing to Kamala Harris.
So let's dig into Biden and Trump. Now, Trump obviously has been as aggressive in his rhetoric towards China, I guess, as it's possible. It's racist. He blames the COVID on China and goes on and on. But Biden has chimed in. And do you think Biden has chimed in because he just wants to take that card away from Trump in the election campaign? Or does this reflect a broader consensus that the rivalry with China is going to heat up? I know when we looked into his Biden's climate plan on his website, there's a very interesting section dealing with the how to end fossil fuel subsidies. And he says that he wants to end fossil fuel subsidies in the United States, but he's going to use pressure to force China to end fossil fuel subsidies, coal and elsewise. And then he specifically goes after this Belt and Road Initiative of China, and that alternative funding to the countries that have signed on to the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative should be offered to break these countries away from China. And he links this to the issue of fossil fuel subsidies, which I don't quite get what the heck the connection is. But it seems this rhetoric coming from Biden is much deeper than just trying to outshout Trump.
Yes, I agree. I think that Biden really believes that the U.S. should regain its role at the head of the table, meaning its role in leadership of the entire world, sees China as a rival. We know that it was under the Obama administration that the pivot to Asia really began. And I think Biden follows along that line, thinks that the U.S. should strengthen its military forces in the region, should continue on these military exercises that are a threat to China, and should be pushing back on China as a superpower. So I don't think it's just rhetoric. I think it's for real. And I think that we will see under a Biden administration this kind of beefing up of the U.S. forces in the region and a new level of military buildup, which will be just what the military-industrial complex loves, a new war and a war with a major power that will justify the staggering Pentagon budget.
Well, I'm not sure they want a new war with China, but they sure want a good old almost war.
Yes, no, a new threat. A Cold War that continues to allow for the call for, oh my goodness, China has increased its budget for its military. It's gotten, it's advanced in its weapons, so we have to get more advanced weapons. And of course, this justifies this nuclear modernization. So I think Biden is all in when it comes to seeing China as a threat.
Which is so crazy, especially when it comes to the issue of climate, because if there isn't a collaboration and international agreements, most importantly, including China and the United States, on climate issues, we're kind of screwed, because one of the things that happens is China doesn't take more action because the U.S. isn't. The U.S. uses China not taking action as an excuse. I mean, this is existential for human life as we know it. And this rhetoric, this antagonistic rhetoric coming from Biden and Trump, but Biden as well. How after this kind of talk, how do you go and start negotiating climate agreements?
Well, I mean, on the other hand, there have been, and this has been thrown back in his face during this campaign, when he has said that rising China is a positive development, that we have to cooperate. There'll be areas of competition, but we do have to cooperate. So, and there is a strong climate movement in the United States that can force that kind of cooperation on the climate. And then we have the issue of the pandemic and the need to cooperate when it comes to the vaccine. And I think there will be pressure to do that as well. So there will be counter pressures, and hopefully that can help in terms of cooperation on the climate.
And I guess that's a thread that will run through every issue we talk about, that at least in theory, and I do believe it to be true to a certain extent, there is a possibility of pressuring the Biden administration on these kinds of issues. The progressive left and so on have zero chance of influencing much of what Trump does.
Well, yes, during these 4 years, every time we do an alert, we say, well, who should we address it to? And it's oftentimes an issue that is decided in the White House, and yet we start laughing if we say, well, address it to Trump. That's just a joke. So to have a chance to address, to fight the Biden administration would be a very positive thing, whether it's on China or it's on, we haven't talked about Latin America at all. And I think there's going to be big movements in Latin America.
I'm going to get to, but I want to do one more Middle East first. I think it's important to clear up the real history on the Libya issue, because Trump tries to posture and say that he was against the Libyan war. And it's simply not true. There's video of Trump at the time not only not opposing the invasion in Libya, but calling on the United States to take all the troops from the Middle East and send them into Libya to overthrow Gaddafi. So the idea that somehow Trump took a non-interventionist position on Libya simply isn't true. On the other hand, one of the things to Biden's merit, if the reports are true, it's been reported Biden opposed the war in Libya and had a fight with Hillary Clinton, and Obama came down on Clinton's side, but that Biden was against that intervention. Is that what you've heard?
It is. On the other hand, we didn't hear Biden. Well, I guess, it's foreign policy has come up so little in this election season. It comes up so little in the debates, but it would be nice to hear Biden talk about how miserably that invasion turned out, and how we have to stop those kinds of interventions because they are worse for people than a leader that might not have been the greatest, but certainly it wasn't the U.S. job to overthrow them.
Well, the next two big areas of the world I want to talk about are both areas which I have the lowest expectation for anything good coming out of the Biden administration. But maybe I'm wrong. But let's start with Russia. The Democratic Party just has so much invested. Well, not just in recent rhetoric about Russia, but from the end of World War II on, that I can't see them being reasonable at all. And frankly, I know, in fact, Trump has actually increased sanctions on Russia and has done some, in terms of military strengthening of neighboring states and so on, has not been so pro-Russia as he's accused of been. On the other hand, it's actually, I think, to his merit that he tried to lower the rhetoric and the level of intensity of the rivalry and so on with Russia. What do you think?
I absolutely agree with you. I hate what the Democrats have been doing when it comes to Russia. And it's not just been Biden. It's been many people within the Democratic Party, even progressives in the Democratic Party, have been just denouncing Trump for not coming down harder on Russia. And, this issue of Russian interference in our elections, I still don't know how much is real and how much is hype. But whatever it is, I don't think it's anything that has a real impact on our elections. And it's certainly not something that the U.S. doesn't do all over the world. So I think the Democrats have backed themselves into a corner when it comes with Russia, and it's going to be very hard for Biden to get beyond that.
Yeah, I've been saying all along about this Russiagate business, as it's called, that I've been taking somewhat similar position as you in the sense I have no idea what's real or what isn't real. But I don't care because whatever they did, even if the Russians did everything they're accused of, which I highly doubt, but let's say they did, it's nothing compared what the American oligarchy does to undermine American democracy. I mean, it doesn't even come close to the funding issues. And
you're not even looking at what we do to undermine democracy around the world. You're saying.
Well, never mind. Well, let's forget that because that's like shooting fish in a barrel to go after that one. No, what they do to American democracy, the Russians can't come close to what the American oligarchy does. It's just ridiculous. But just for a minute, why is the progressives in the Democratic Party and around it and so on that bought into this anti-Russian fervor about election meddling? Is it because they really believe that it's such a threat, or it's just a partisan weapon they can use because they hate Trump so much?
I don't know, but it's seeped down into a large chunk of the American public, and I think it's very dangerous. The whole anti-Russia sentiment, this feeling that yes, don't look at our own oligarchy about how they're what they do to our democracy. Let's look at the Russians. I don't know which is the answer to your question. I just know that the consequences are very dangerous. I go to a lot of protests in Washington, D.C., and it just amazed me, Paul, to see people who were progressive on so many issues were out in front of the White House protesting Russia. And Russian interference in our elections, and that Trump was Putin's puppet, although they'd use worse terms than that. And so you don't know for the people on the top what reasons they do it, but you can see the effects that it has.
Well, people on the top, I get. I mean, people who need what we were talking about earlier to keep defending the basic raison d'etre for having such a massive military-industrial complex. And there's real competition with the Russians in different areas, but very significantly in arms sales. Some really serious competition takes place globally. I mean, I get why sections of the elites, and for partisan advantage and so on, I get that. But for progressives to buy into this stuff, it's very dangerous to invoke the demons of the Cold War and use them because you think it gives you some temporary political advantage. It will come back to bite you. You can't unleash the idiocy and the kind of McCarthyite fervor and think it's okay to use because you're using it against the Trump, and not think that someday it may help give some moral, ideological kind of support to some real provocation against Russia. And in saying that, I'm no big defender of Putin. I'm no big defender of the Russian oligarchy. He's an authoritarian. It's not very democratic in Russia, to say the least. And I think Putin does nurture the far right in Europe. But let's talk about that stuff, not interfering in a U.S. election, which is just to feed into the narrative of this Cold War nonsense.
Right. And then that also feeds into the issue around NATO and the Democrats trying to say, and Biden in his campaign, that they would be more pro-NATO than Trump has been. Trump certainly had his moment when he talked about NATO being obsolete, his moment of clarity, but then turned to saying, no, we want to strengthen NATO. NATO is great. The only thing that should happen is that the Europeans should pay more for their military and our military. And then the Biden campaign coming back and saying, no, we're the ones who would really strengthen NATO. And Trump wants to take troops out of Germany because he has a beef with Angela Merkel, and we want to stop him from taking those troops out. And so along with the Russia threat narrative comes the need to pour more money into NATO, strengthen NATO, make sure U.S. troops continue to be stationed around Russia's border. And so once again, we have that feeding of the militarism.
And it's going to be for making money. What is NATO supposed to do? In a million years, the Russians are not marching into Europe. What would they do with it when they got there? You can't occupy these kinds of countries. I mean, it's insane. So it's like the whole picture of it as if it wouldn't get nuclear pretty quickly, or let's say you march in and you're successful. Then what do? They couldn't even hold on to Eastern Europe, never mind Western Europe. I mean, the thing is just nuts.
Yeah, but as you know, these military expenditures then have a life of their own. And when you have thousands and thousands of U.S. troops in places like Germany, then the towns around that depend on the U.S. troops for their income, and they want to keep that going. And the contractors who build those facilities and maintain them want to keep that going. And it really becomes not about any kind of protection anymore, any strategic end. It's just about keeping what is there. And as you said, it's about making money.
And they are concerned about the extent Europe becomes increasingly dependent on Russian energy exports. But so what? What does NATO do? What does NATO do about that? I mean,
NATO's not going to do anything about that.
What are they going to go blow up pipelines or something? I mean, the whole thing is, I can't see what else it is about money making, but that's true about most of military policy. Even the whole Daniel Ellsberg makes the point that there's absolutely no military rationale for ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, because all the major powers know where the other ones have them, and they actually are just targets. The real deterrent, and it is, I guess, deterrent or threat, is missiles based on submarines, because they're not so easy to keep track of or to counteract. But ICBMs are very profitable, so they keep building new ICBMs. And in this new nuclear expansion, modernization you're talking about, I think Obama started it. It's $1 trillion, I think it is, over 30 years, but most of that money is going to be spent over the first 10 years of that. There's a whole new whack of ICBMs. Actually, let's talk a little bit about the difference between Biden and Trump on nuclear weapons. What's your take on that?
The Biden administration would be more likely to go back into some of these deals that the Trump administration has pulled out of. And, things like the Space Force that the Trump administration has started. I don't know if Biden sees that as ridiculous as so many people in the military do. So I think there are positive things. It would be very much like the Obama era, which is that you wouldn't, as you said, you got the negotiations during the Obama era around the modernization of nuclear weapons. So it's not like we would be going back on that.
Well, actually, let me say another thing to Biden's credit. I find it amazing I'm in a position of having to defend Biden after so many years of opposing him on so many questions.
It's all relative, we know.
Well, this one's even less than all relative. It's been reported, maybe his last name is Kagan, something like that. He wrote a book on nuclear weapons policy. And he reports that Biden was very much opposed to this expansion of the nuclear weapons program, that Obama did it because he wanted the Republicans to cooperate on the anti-nuclear treaty. And the Republicans were saying, we're only going to cooperate on the treaty if you do this massive modernization of nuclear weapons. And the report is that Biden told Obama, they're never going to live up to this. You don't need to make this deal because they're never going to go along with you anyway. And we shouldn't be doing this. So if that's true, and I asked Wilkerson this as well, and he says he's heard it is true. And this kind of argument between Biden and Obama doesn't go public. But then that's actually not a bad sign for Biden. Now, that said, I agree with you. He's never going to reverse that kind of commitment.
Well, and the other thing that's happened in the intervening time is that there is now a UN ban on nuclear weapons, a UN peace treaty, a nuclear ban treaty that just went into effect this week when Honduras became the 50th nation to ratify it. And that gives a lot of momentum in the United States from the grassroots to be pushing for the U.S. to join that. Now, you might laugh at that at this point, but I think it's a goal that we have to have. And I would rather be pushing that under a Biden administration than under a Trump one. Well,
I wouldn't laugh at it in that I'm working, people that listen to the analysis, I've mentioned this before, I'm working on a documentary based on Daniel Ellsberg's book, Doomsday Machine, and getting into this topic somewhat. And most of the people that know military affairs, that know nuclear issues, that really pay attention to this, they don't think it's a question of if there's going to be an accidental nuclear war and maybe a somewhat intentional, something conventional that spirals out of control. They think it's only a question of when, especially on the accidental side. They think it could be tomorrow. This is not an abstraction. And the extent to which I think many of us, and I include myself until I started talking to Ellsberg, we're not pandemic deniers and we're not climate crisis deniers, but many of us are nuclear war deniers. We don't take how seriously this threat is.
Well, yes. And when I said don't laugh about it, I'm saying because of the massive money that is made in the development of nuclear weapons and the modernization of these nuclear weapons, and the fact that there is this 30-year span that we have already said that we're allocating $1 trillion to go against that and get the U.S. to sign a ban on nuclear weapons is going against major forces of companies that the big weapons makers are the same ones, whether it's nuclear weapons or non-nuclear weapons, and they have tremendous influence in our government.
Well, Ellsberg argues, well, a ban would be good. We shouldn't argue or make that the main issue right now. He just thinks it's so unwinnable. But there should be a massive reduction, massive. The actual number of nuclear weapons that are needed to be a deterrent is probably less than 20. And we're talking thousands now in the U.S. and in Russia. China, which has limited, from what I've been told by people who know these things, probably to around 200. But apparently now we're talking about a big expansion of their nuclear weapons program, and partly because of how unhinged Trump has been and how much more threatened they feel by something crazy happening. This really does need to get way more on everybody's front burner, if you will, the issue of nuclear. But we're kind of running out of time. So before we do, let's talk about Latin America. Do you see a difference there? You have the socialists have come back to power in Bolivia. Trump was unsuccessful, even with Elliot Abrams, the Darth Vader of Latin America. We're not able to bring down the Venezuelan government yet. But do you see a difference with Biden? His rhetoric has not been certainly any better.
Well, I think Biden would not put the military option on the table when it comes to Venezuela. it's going to be hard to get him to lift some of those sanctions because he's gotten in bed with a lot of the Venezuelan Americans and the Cuban Americans in Florida. I do think we would have more luck on Cuba because that's reverting back to the Obama years and the success there in terms of reestablishing relations with Cuba. So I think that could happen. I think there's going to be more changes in Latin America. We have elections coming up in Ecuador. This just great victory in Chile for rewriting their constitution. Perhaps we are on the verge of another what they call the pink tide in Latin America, of progressive governments coming to power. And I think that it's better to have a Biden administration in there than a Trump administration because you get the evils like Elliott Abrams. We circle back, Paul, to where we began and mentioned several times in this conversation about we need to have more of a movement in the United States that pushes for change of U.S. foreign policy. And when it comes to Latin America, we're trying to build momentum for a new good neighbor policy based on non-intervention, respect for sovereignty. And I think that we will have a better chance of building something like that up under a Biden administration or getting some effective changes in U.S. policy under a Biden administration.
Yeah, and it all, I think, does come down to what you just said, which is there going to be a real movement both on domestic issues and foreign policy issues? There really needs to be a popular front and a serious mass movement.
And when it comes to that, I mean, there is some positive developments in terms of uniting groups that work on individual countries in Latin America. And then there's all the immigration issues that affect so much all of Central America and Mexico. And we have made some good gains in the last couple of years of uniting domestic and international issues when it comes to things like the defund the police, defund the Pentagon, or the questions around climate change at home, and you can't separate them from climate issues internationally, and the issue of racism at home and racism in terms of U.S. policies overseas. So we do have, I think, the beginnings of a positive way to build up a movement that's not just considered people who work on peace issues, but who work on these social justice and climate issues as well.
All right. Thanks very much for joining us, Medea.
Nice to be on with you, Paul.
And thank you for joining us on the theAnalysis.news podcast. And again, don't forget, there's a donate button at the top of the webpage.